When we think of Queen Victoria, we think of the British Empire and a venerable royal legacy. So what would you think if I told you that one of her own great-grandchildren was a high-ranking Nazi official, a confidant, and personal envoy for Adolf Hitler? His name was Prince Philipp of Hesse. He was a bridge between the old aristocratic world and the new brutal regime, a man who believed he could control the Nazis to restore his family's glory. It was a gamble that would cost him everything. He sought power, but the price was betrayal, and ultimately the gates of a concentration camp. A prince gambled that he could ride Nazism to restore his class. To understand why a prince like Philip would ever be tempted by a movement as radical as Nazism, we must examine the profound desperation that permeated the world of the German aristocracy in the aftermath of the First World War, a conflict that not only decimated Europe's population, but also dismantled long-standing social and political structures. Prince Philipp's Germany emerged from the ruins of a catastrophic defeat, where the once mighty German Empire, proclaimed in 1871 at Versailles' Hall of Mirrors as a symbol of Prussian dominance under Otto von Bismarck, lay in utter humiliation by November 1918. The war had claimed over 2 million German lives, with another 4.3 million wounded, leaving a generation scarred and the economy in tatters from the Allied blockade that starved the home front, causing widespread malnutrition and contributing to the 1918 to 19 influenza pandemic's deadly toll within Germany. The armistice signed on November 11, 1918, in a railway car at Compiègne-Forest, marked not just the cessation of hostilities, but the beginning of a punitive peace process orchestrated by the victorious Allies, primarily France, Britain, and the United States, who sought to prevent future German aggression through demilitarization and economic penalties. The Treaty of Versailles, formally signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that sparked the war, imposed draconian terms that crippled Germany financially, territorially, and psychologically. Under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, a stipulation that fueled resentment as it justified the Allies' demands, ignoring the complex web of alliances and mobilizations that had escalated the July crisis of 1914 into global conflict. Reparations were set at 132 billion gold marks, approximately $33 billion at the time, equivalent to over $500 billion in today's terms. Payable over decades, with initial installments requiring the handover of gold reserves, coal, and merchant ships, exacerbating post-war economic instability and leading to defaults that prompted French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr industrial region in 1923. Territorially, Germany lost 13% of its pre-war land and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine reverted to France, Eupen-Malmedy to Belgium, northern Schleswig to Denmark via plebiscite, and vast eastern territories, including Posen and West Prussia, to the newly independent Poland, creating the Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the German heartland and sowed seeds for future border disputes. Colonial possessions in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, totaling over 2.5 million square kilometers, were redistributed as League of Nations mandates, stripping Germany of its overseas empire built during the scramble for Africa under Kaiser Wilhelm II's Weltpolitik. Militarily, the treaty limited the army to 100,000 men with no tanks, heavy artillery, or general staff, the Navy to 6 battleships and no submarines, and prohibited an air force altogether, while demilitarizing the Rhineland as a buffer zone occupied by Allied troops until 1935. These measures, intended to ensure peace, instead bred a stab-in-the-back myth propagated by conservative nationalists who blamed domestic traitors, socialists, Jews, and Republicans, for the defeat rather than military exhaustion, further polarizing society and undermining the new government's legitimacy. For aristocratic families, like the Hesses, whose Hessian Grand Duchy had been integrated into the empire and whose members had served in high military and diplomatic roles, this humiliation represented a personal affront, as their class had been intertwined with the imperial structure, providing officers, advisors, and even intermarriages with the Hohenzollern dynasty. The 1920s saw the precarious birth of the Weimar Republic, Germany's first real attempt at democracy, established amid the revolutionary turmoil of November 1918, when sailors' mutinies in Kiel spread to workers' councils across the country, forcing Kaiser Wilhelm II's abdication and the proclamation of a republic by Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann. Named after the city where its constitution was drafted in 1919 to evade Berlin's chaos, the Weimar system introduced universal suffrage, including for women, a first in German history, proportional representation, and civil liberties under a semi-presidential framework with Friedrich Ebert as the first president. However, it was a fragile entity from inception, plagued by structural weaknesses. The proportional electoral system fragmented parliament into dozens of parties, leading to unstable coalitions, 14 governments between 1919 and 1930, and frequent use of Article 48, which allowed the president to rule by decree in emergencies, eroding democratic norms. Economic turmoil defined the era, with the hyperinflation crisis of 1923 serving as its nadir, triggered by the Ruhr occupation when French and Belgian troops seized factories to extract reparations in kind after Germany's default, prompting passive resistance funded by printing money unchecked. By November 1923, the mark's value plummeted to 4.2 trillion per US dollar, up from 4.2 in 1914. Prices doubled every few days, forcing workers to be paid twice daily and spend wages immediately, with scenes of citizens using wheelbarrows or suitcases to carry billions of marks for basic goods like bread, which cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. Savings were wiped out, middle-class families pawned heirlooms, and barter economies emerged in rural areas, while speculators profited, widening inequality and fostering resentment toward the republic seen as complicit in the Versailles Diktat. Stabilization came via the Rentenmark, introduced by Hjalmar Schacht in November 1923, and the Dawes Plan in 1924, which rescheduled reparations and provided U.S. loans, ushering in the golden 20s of relative prosperity from 1924 to 1929, marked by cultural flourishing in Berlin, jazz clubs, Bauhaus architecture, and figures like Marlene Dietrich, but underpinned by fragile foreign credit that collapsed with the 1929 Wall Street crash. Political violence permeated the period, with over 376 political assassinations between 1919 and 1922 alone, as far-left groups like the Spartacists, led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, crushed in the January 1919 uprising, clashed with far-right Freikorps paramilitaries, former soldiers numbering 250,000 to 400,000, who suppressed communist revolts in Berlin, Munich, and the Ruhr, but also staged putsches like the 1920 Kapp Putsch, attempting to restore monarchy. Street battles in cities like Hamburg and Dresden involved machine guns and grenades, while the 1923 beer hall putsch in Munich, led by Adolf Hitler and the nascent Nazi Party, highlighted the right's growing audacity, though it failed and landed Hitler in prison where he penned Mein Kampf. This chaos eroded faith in democracy, with voter turnout high but polarized between the Social Democrats, SPD, Center Party, and rising extremists, as the Republic survived 20 coup attempts in its first 5 years. For the German aristocracy, the interwar years represented a profound crisis of identity and survival, as the November Revolution of 1918 not only toppled the monarchy, but systematically dismantled their privileged status embedded in the imperial order. The Weimar Constitution of August 1919 abolished all noble titles as legal distinctions under Article 109, reducing them to mere surnames. Thus, Prince Philipp von Hesse became simply Philipp Hesse, while confiscating crown lands and ending state subsidies for aristocratic families, forcing many to sell estates or seek employment in business or diplomacy. Families like the Hesses, descended from the Landgraves of Hesse-Darmstadt and connected to European royalty through marriages, including to the British and Russian houses, retained substantial wealth from private properties such as castles in Kassel and Darmstadt, vineyards, and art collections valued in millions, but lost their feudal purpose as rulers and patrons in a society shifting toward egalitarianism. The revolution's waves extended to land reforms in states like Prussia, where the 1919 to 1920 laws redistributed large estates, Juncker's latifundia, exceeding 100 hectares, to small farmers and war veterans, eroding the economic base of nobility who had dominated agriculture and military leadership. Socially, they became relics of a lost world, adrift in a democratic society they deeply distrusted, viewing Weimar's cultural liberalism, cabarets, women's emancipation, and avant-garde art as moral decay, while resenting the rise of bourgeois politicians and trade unions that challenged their traditional authority. Many, including Philippe, were driven by two great fears: the threat of a communist revolution, akin to the 1917 Bolshevik uprising in Russia, which had executed Tsar Nicholas II, a cousin to many German nobles, and his family in 1918, expropriated estates and triggered a Red Terror that killed thousands of aristocrats, prompting waves of white Russian émigrés to Germany who shared horror stories of class warfare. This anxiety was heightened by domestic events, like the 1919 Bavarian Soviet Republic, a short-lived communist state in Munich crushed by Freikorps, and the 1920 Ruhr Red Army uprising involving 50,000 armed workers demanding nationalization. Equally pressing was the perceived decay of Germany's national honor, tarnished by Versailles' humiliations, disarmament, occupation, and the war guilt label, that nobles, with their martial heritage, saw as an existential insult, fueling revanchism and nostalgia for Wilhelmina glory. Organizations like the Deutscher Adelgenossenschaft, German Nobility Association, founded in 1920 with over 20,000 members, lobbied for restoration of privileges and aligned with conservative parties like the DNVP, German National People's Party, which advocated monarchy's return and treaty revision. They longed for a strong authoritarian leader who could crush communism through decisive action, perhaps modeled on Benito Mussolini's 1922 March on Rome that established fascism in Italy as an anti-Bolshevik bulwark, tear up the Versailles Treaty via rearmament and diplomacy, and restore Germany to its former glory as a great power, evoking the unified empire's economic might and cultural prestige before 1914. This sentiment was widespread among ex-officers and landowners who viewed parliamentary democracy as weak and divisive, incapable of addressing unemployment, peaking at 6 million in 1932, or foreign encroachments. It was in this fertile ground of fear, resentment, and wounded pride that the Nazi Party began to grow. Led by the charismatic Adolf Hitler, the party offered a potent and toxic cocktail of promises. They would crush the hated communists, tear up the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, and restore German honor through an authoritarian hand. Through masterful propaganda and the brutal street fighting of their paramilitary brown shirts, the SA, they positioned themselves as the only force capable of saving the nation from chaos. For many German aristocrats adrift in a world they no longer recognized and terrified of a Bolshevik-style revolution, this message was intoxicating. They chose to see not a thuggish mob, but the illusion of a national rebirth, a return to the hierarchical order they understood. It was this illusion that captured Prince Philip. For him, a man haunted by his family's lost status, Nazism appeared to be the only salvation from the failures of the Republic and the specter of further decline. Prince Philip's life began with all the promise of his illustrious heritage, rooted in one of Europe's most interconnected royal families, where his birth positioned him at the crossroads of German, British, and broader continental nobility. Born on November 6, 1896 at Schloss Rumpenheim in Offenbach am Main, Hesse, Germany, a neoclassical palace built in the 18th century by the Landgraves of Hesse-Kassel, and serving as a summer residence for the family, he was the third son of Prince Frederick Charles of Hesse and Princess Margaret of Prussia. His father, Prince Frederick Charles, born in 1868, was the head of the House of Hesse-Kassel from 1888 onward, a branch of the ancient Hessian dynasty that traced its origins to the 13th century and had ruled as landgraves and electors until the annexation by Prussia in 1866 during the Austro-Prussian War. Frederick Charles briefly held the title of King of Finland in October 1918. Elected by the Finnish parliament as Väinö I amid the chaos following the Russian Revolution and Finland's independence declaration in 1917, though he renounced the throne in December 1918 after Germany's defeat in World War I made the monarchy untenable in the face of Republican sentiments and Allied pressures. Through his mother, Princess Margaret of Prussia, born 1872, who was the youngest sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last German emperor and king of Prussia, Philip was directly linked to the Hohenzollern dynasty that had unified Germany in 1871 and ruled until the empire's collapse in 1918. Margaret, known as Mossy in family circles, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria through her mother, Victoria, Princess Royal, who had married Frederick III of Germany, thus embedding Philip in the vast Victorian family network that spanned European thrones. On his paternal side, Philip's grandmother was Princess Alice of the United Kingdom, the second daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who had married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, making Philip a great-grandson of the British Queen, and placing him distantly in the line of succession to the British throne, though far removed, as the succession favored direct descendants of Victoria's sons and elder daughters. This British connection was further emphasized by Alice's role in establishing the Hessian branches, ties to England, where she had promoted progressive causes like women's education and nursing, influences that lingered in family traditions. Philip had 5 brothers, an older brother, Friedrich Wilhelm, born 1893, died 1916 in World War I, Maximilian, born 1894, killed in action 1914. Twins Wolfgang and Richard, born 1901. And another twin, Christoph, born 1901, but Richard and Christoph were the younger set. His upbringing was cosmopolitan, blending the strict Prussian military and educational ethos of his German heritage with the refined, liberal influences of English culture inherited from his grandmother Alice, and reinforced through family visits and schooling abroad. Raised initially under the care of an English governess who instilled British manners and language fluency, Philipp was sent to England in 1910 at age 14 to attend school in Bexhill-on-Sea, Sussex, a coastal town popular for preparatory education among European elites, where he absorbed English literature, history, and sports like cricket and rowing, fostering a bilingual and bicultural perspective that contrasted with the more rigid German system. Upon returning to Germany around 1912, he enrolled in the Musterschule in Frankfurt, a progressive secondary school emphasizing sciences and humanities, followed by the Real Gymnasium in Potsdam, a prestigious institution near Berlin, known for preparing students for university with a focus on classical languages, mathematics, and physical education. But unlike his brothers who entered military academies, Philipp's interests were more intellectual than martial, a choice that set him apart from a young age. This education occurred against the backdrop of the Wilhelmina Empire's opulence, with family residences including the Grand Schloss Friedrichshof in Kronberg, built by his grandmother Alice as a widow's retreat, and the palatial castle properties, where summers involved hunting, riding, and courtly gatherings that exposed him to diplomats and royalty from across Europe. After serving in the First World War, where the conflict's outbreak in August 1914 thrust the 17-year-old Philipp into active duty despite his youth, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Hessian Dragoon Regiment No. 24, a cavalry unit based in Darmstadt, and deployed to the Western Front in Belgium, participating in the early mobile warfare before the trench stalemate set in. There, he witnessed the death of his brother Maximilian in October 1914 during fighting near Ypres, a loss that compounded the family's grief when another brother, Friedrich Wilhelm, died in Romania in September 1916 from wounds sustained in combat on the Eastern Front. Philipp himself served on multiple fronts, in 1915 to 1916 on the Eastern Front in Ukraine, where he handled ordnance procurement rather than direct combat, reflecting his organizational skills. Then in 1917 on the Siegfried Line, part of the Hindenburg Line defenses, in France enduring the grueling attrition battles, and back to Ukraine in 1918, where he was wounded by shrapnel, but recovered to continue service until the armistice. Decorated with the Iron Cross Second Class for bravery, his wartime experience mirrored the aristocracy's high casualty rate, as nobles often led charges, the war's futility influencing his post-war disillusionment with the old order. Following the armistice and the German Revolution that abolished the monarchy, Philipp briefly joined the Übergangsheer, transitional army, in 1919, a makeshift force that suppressed communist uprisings in Berlin and Munich, aligning with Free Corps units to quash Spartacist revolts led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, actions that hardened his anti-Bolshevik stance. Demobilized by 1920 under Versailles restrictions limiting the Reichswehr to 100,000 men, he turned to civilian life, enrolling at the Technical University of Darmstadt from 1920 to 1922 to study art history and architecture, disciplines that appealed to his aesthetic sensibilities, nurtured by family collections of Renaissance paintings and Baroque furnishings. During this period, He made several trips to Greece, visiting his aunt Princess Sophie, wife of King Constantine I, where he explored ancient sites like the Acropolis and Delphi, deepening his interest in classical design and archaeology, though he left university without a degree to pursue practical experience. In 1922, he apprenticed at the Kaiser Friedrich Museum, now Bode Museum, in Berlin, cataloging artifacts from the Kaiser's personal collection, which had been nationalized after Wilhelm II's exile to Doorn, Netherlands, in 1918, providing hands-on training in curation amid Weimar's cultural boom of Expressionism and Bauhaus innovation. By 1923, seeking broader horizons amid Germany's hyperinflation crisis, he relocated to Rome, establishing a successful interior design firm that catered to wealthy expatriates and Italian nobility, drawing on his earlier work designing furniture for his father's abortive Finnish palace project, which involved neoclassical motifs inspired by Nordic and Hessian styles. His designs featured elegant symmetries, antique reproductions, and modern comforts, securing commissions for villas and apartments, leveraging his aristocratic network to build a clientele that included diplomats and artists in the Eternal City's vibrant scene. In 1925, he married Princess Mafalda of Savoy, a match that united two of Europe's historic royal families. Mafalda, born November 19, 1902 in Rome, was the second daughter of King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, reigned 1900 to 1946, and Queen Elena of Montenegro, a petite, dark-haired beauty known for her intelligence, musical talents — she played piano and violin — and charitable work, including nursing during World War I. The wedding was a major European social event, attended by over 1,000 guests, including royalty from Britain, Spain, and Scandinavia, with ceremonies blending Catholic rites, Mafalda's faith, and Protestant elements, Philip's Lutheran background, featuring a procession of horse-drawn carriages, fireworks, and a banquet with Italian delicacies like risotto and Barolo wine. It united the German House of Hesse, with its Protestant Hessian roots and connections to the defunct German Empire, with the Italian Royal House of Savoy, Catholic monarchs, who had unified Italy in 1861 and maintained a constitutional monarchy amid rising fascist influences under Benito Mussolini, who had seized power in the 1922 March on Rome. By all accounts, it was a genuine love match, sparked during Philip's Roman sojourn, when they met at social gatherings hosted by the Italian court, with Mafalda's vivacity complementing Philip's scholarly demeanor, leading to a courtship involving shared interests in art, visits to the Vatican museums and Florence's Uffizi, and family approvals secured through diplomatic channels. They settled in Villa Polissena, also known as Villa Savoia, a neoclassical mansion in Rome's Parioli district, part of the larger Villa Ada complex owned by the Savoy family, featuring manicured gardens, frescoed interiors, and modern amenities like a private cinema, where they hosted salons with intellectuals, artists like Giorgio de Chirico, and diplomats. The couple had 4 children: Moritz, born August 6, 1926 in Rome, who later became Landgrave of Hesse in 1940 upon his grandfather's death, and pursued archaeology. Heinrich, born October 30, 1927 in Rome, died November 18, 1999, known for his quiet life and avoidance of politics. Otto, born June 3, 1937 in Rome, died January 3, 1998 in Hanover, who worked in business. And Elizabeth, born October 8, 1940 in Rome, who married into minor nobility and focused on family. Their family life was one of cultured elegance, with summers at Hessian estates like Schloss Wolfsgarten near Frankfurt for hunting and riding, winters in Rome attending operas at Teatro dell'Opera and charitable galas, an education for the children emphasizing multilingualism, German, Italian, English, and arts, reflecting the parents' passions, Mafalda's patronage of music conservatories, and Philip's design projects. The household included governesses, tutors, and staff, maintaining a routine of family meals, religious observances, blending traditions, and travels to relatives in England and Greece, fostering a stable, affectionate environment amid Europe's turbulent 1930s. But beneath the surface of this refined existence, Philip was drawn to the new, radical political movements sweeping across Europe in the interwar period, movements that promised order, national revival, and a rejection of liberal democracy's perceived weaknesses. While living in Italy from 1923 onward, he came to admire Benito Mussolini's fascism, which had consolidated power by 1925 through the Acerbo Law, enabling one-party rule and the 1926 suppression of opposition, transforming Italy into a totalitarian state with corporatist economics, militaristic youth organizations like the Balia, and grandiose public works such as the draining of Pontine marshes and the Via dell'Impero in Rome. He saw it as a dynamic force that brought order, ending the post-war chaos of strikes and socialist uprisings that had plagued Italy in 1919 to 1922, and national pride, evident in Mussolini's imperial ambitions like the 1923 Corfu incident and cultural revival through Roman symbolism, appealing to Philip's historical sensibilities and fear of communism after witnessing Bolshevik atrocities via Russian emigre relatives. His proximity to the Italian court through marriage to Mafalda, whose father, Victor Emmanuel III, had appointed Mussolini prime minister in 1922 and tolerated his dictatorship, allowed Philippe to observe fascism's mechanisms firsthand, including the over-secret police and propaganda via Cinecittà films glorifying the regime. Back in Germany during visits in the late 1920s, he perceived a similar energy in Adolf Hitler's burgeoning Nazi Party, founded in 1920 as the NSDAP, which by 1929 had grown from fringe status to a potent force amid the Great Depression, polling 18.3% in the 1930 Reichstag elections, with promises of Versailles abrogation, anti-Semitism as scapegoating for economic woes, and a National Socialist program blending welfare for Aryans with authoritarian control. The party's paramilitary SA brown shirts, led by Ernst Röhm and numbering 100,000 by 1930, mirrored fascist black shirts in street violence against communists, appealing to Philip's wartime anti-Bolshevik experiences and aristocratic disdain for Weimar's parliamentary gridlock. In October 1930, during a stay in Berlin, Philippe formally joined the Nazi Party with membership number 418,991 and the SA as a Sturmabteilung member, motivated by Hitler's charisma displayed at rallies like the 1929 Nuremberg Congress and the party's anti-communist stance, which resonated with nobles fearing Soviet-style expropriation after the Russian Revolution claimed relatives like Grand Duchess Elizabeth, his great-aunt. His royal status made him a huge propaganda asset for Hitler, who wanted to win over conservative elites skeptical of the Nazi Party's working-class origins. Using Philip's Hessian pedigree, descended from electors and linked to European crowns, to demonstrate that Nazism transcended class, attracting the highest echelons of society, as evidenced by other noble recruits like Prince August Wilhelm of Prussia, the Kaiser's son, who joined in 1930. Photographs of Philippe in SA uniform at party events, such as the 1932 Potsdam Day ceremony blending Old Prussia with new Nazism, were disseminated in Völkischer Beobachter to counter perceptions of the movement as mere street thugs, instead portraying it as a national revival embracing tradition. When Hitler came to power on January 30th, 1933, appointed Chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg in a coalition with conservatives, Philipp's rise was swift, facilitated by his early loyalty and connections. On June 7, 1933, he was appointed Oberpresident, governor of the province of Hesse-Nassau by Hermann Göring, then Prussian Interior Minister, a role overseeing administration in a key industrial region, including Frankfurt and Wiesbaden, where he implemented Nazi policies like Aryanization of Jewish businesses, over 1,000 firms seized by 1938, and coordination of the Gestapo's regional operations. In July 1933, Göring named him to the Prussian State Council, a ceremonial body advising on legislation, and by 1934, he held the rank of SA Obergruppenführer, Lieutenant General, participating in the Night of the Long Knives Purge that eliminated Rome and consolidated Hitler's power. But his most important role was far more personal and diplomatic, leveraging his marriage to Mafalda, whose father, King Victor Emmanuel III, had legitimized Mussolini's regime, to become the ideal confidential messenger between Hitler and Mussolini. From 1933 onward, Philip carried private letters and verbal messages between the two dictators, his princely status and Italian family ties granting him unrestricted travel via diplomatic passports and private trains, evading scrutiny during sensitive negotiations like the 1934 Dollfuss assassination aftermath or the 1936 Rome-Berlin Axis formation. Notable missions included delivering Hitler's reassurances to Mussolini before the 1938 Anschluss of Austria on March 11th, ensuring Italian non-interference and facilitating cultural exchanges that masked military pacts. He also served as Hitler's personal art agent, utilizing his expertise in art history, gained from Darmstadt studies and Berlin museum work, to acquire priceless artworks in Italy for the Führer's planned Führer Museum in Linz, Austria, envisioned as a grand repository of Aryan culture. A special account at the German embassy in Rome, funded by Reichsbank transfers, enabled purchases of Renaissance masters like Botticelli sketches and Venetian sculptures from private collections and dealers, often at inflated prices or through coerced sales from Jewish owners fleeing fascist anti-Semitic laws enacted in 1938, mimicking Nuremberg laws. This role intensified after the 1937 Degenerate Art Exhibition in Munich purged modern works, with Philip negotiating deals until Italy banned foreign art exports in September 1941 to preserve national heritage amid wartime shortages. For a time, spanning 1933 to 1943, Philippe had it all. He was restoring his family's political influence, diminished since the 1918 revolution abolished Hessian autonomy and titles by aligning with the regime's power structure, serving a leader he admired for ostensibly revitalizing Germany through economic recovery. Unemployment dropped from 6 million in 1932 to under 1 million by 1938 via Autobahn projects and rearmament, and foreign triumphs like the 1936 Rhineland remilitarization, and living a life of purpose, blending diplomatic intrigue, cultural patronage, and family stability in Rome and Kassel. He had placed himself at the center of the new political order that fascism was creating in Europe, where the Axis alliance, formalized in the 1939 Pact of Steel, promised a reordered continent under authoritarian nationalism, with Philip embodying the fusion of old aristocracy and new ideology, facilitating summits like the 1938 Munich Agreement that appeased Hitler on Czechoslovakia and the 1940 Brenner Pass meetings coordinating war efforts. This period saw him host lavish events at Villa Polissena, entertaining Goebbels and Ciano, while his children grew up in a bilingual household, unaware of the regime's darkening atrocities like the 1938 Kristallnacht pogroms, or Italy's Ethiopian conquest in 1935 to 1936, which Philip viewed as imperial restoration, akin to Bismarck's colonialism. Yet this apex concealed emerging tensions, as Hitler's suspicion of nobility grew, culminating in Philip's 1943 arrest after Mussolini's fall, marking the unraveling of his privileged position amid the war's turning tide. The heart of Prince Philip's life was his family, and particularly his deep love for his wife, Princess Mafalda, a relationship that provided him with emotional anchor amid the demands of his political and diplomatic roles in the Nazi regime. Their marriage was characterized by mutual respect and affection, with Philip often expressing in private letters his admiration for Mafalda's intelligence and warmth, qualities that balanced his own more reserved and ambitious nature. This bond endured through the challenges of living between Rome and Germany, where they raised their 4 children in an environment that, on the surface, reflected the privileges of their royal status. Summers at Hessian estates like Schloss Wolfsgarten for family gatherings, and winters in Rome attending cultural events. Yet what made their connection rare was its resilience in an era when ideological pressures fractured many elite unions. Philip's devotion is evident in his post-war reflections, where he described Mafalda as his greatest support, even as their differing views on the regime created unspoken strains. Their profound personal connection stood as a rare constant amid the political turbulence of their era, where the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany forced couples in their social circle to navigate conflicting loyalties, often leading to divorces or public ruptures among other noble families. Philip, shaped by his wartime experiences and post-war disillusionment with the Weimar Republic, saw in Mafalda not only a partner, but a source of stability. Her Montenegrin Italian heritage brought a Mediterranean vibrancy to his Germanic upbringing, fostering a household where bilingual conversations and shared interests in art, such as joint visits to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, strengthened their intimacy. However, beneath their loving marriage was a deep and growing conflict over their political beliefs, one that highlighted the moral and political divergences increasingly evident as the 1930s progressed into war. Mafalda's quiet but firm dislike of the Nazi regime's brutality stemmed from her Catholic upbringing, instilled by her mother, Queen Elena, who emphasized compassion and ethical responsibility. Values reinforced through Mafalda's education at convent schools in Rome, where religious teachings stressed the sanctity of life and opposition to hatred. This foundation clashed sharply with the regime's promotion of racial hierarchy and violence, leading Mafalda to view Nazism's anti-Semitism as a profound moral evil, contrary to Christian principles of charity and equality before God. Historical accounts from family correspondence and testimonies of close associates, such as Mafalda's sister Giovanna, reveal that she privately criticized the regime's policies, expressing horror at events like the 1938 Kristallnacht pogroms, which she learned about through newspaper reports and Philip's own accounts during his visits from Germany. In one documented instance from a 1939 letter to her sister, Mafalda described the Nuremberg laws as inhuman, lamenting how they dehumanized individuals based on birth, a stance that directly contradicted Philip's acceptance of such measures as necessary for national purity. This moral divergence was not openly confrontational. Mafalda avoided direct arguments to preserve marital peace, but it manifested in subtle ways, such as her reluctance to host Nazi officials at their Roman villa, preferring instead gatherings with Italian intellectuals and church figures who shared her ethical concerns. The political aspect of the chasm was equally pronounced. Mafalda, influenced by her father's constitutional monarchy in Italy, distrusted the totalitarian control exerted by Hitler, seeing it as a perversion of governance that eroded individual freedoms, while Philip embraced it as a means to restore German strength against communism. This tension added an underlying layer to their relationship, where love persisted but was shadowed by unspoken disagreements, with Mafalda's empathy for the persecuted clashing against Philip's rationalizations of the regime's actions as temporary necessities for order. Mafalda, known for her kindness and empathy, harbored this quiet but firm dislike that extended beyond personal discomfort to a principled stand against the regime's core ideologies. Her Catholic faith deepened through regular attendance at Mass and involvement in Vatican charitable circles, provided a moral framework that condemned the Nazis' eugenics programs and expansionist wars as violations of divine law, views she confided to trusted friends like the papal nuncio in Rome, who noted her distress over the 1940 invasion of Catholic Poland. This ethical stance created a persistent moral divergence that Philip, in his post-war interviews, acknowledged as a source of private debates, though he downplayed it as minor differences. The political rift was exacerbated by Mafalda's growing awareness of the regime's brutality through reports from Italian diplomats and exiled relatives, leading her to question Philippe's involvement in art acquisitions that often involved coerced sales from Jewish owners, viewing it as complicity in theft rather than cultural preservation. This chasm was not just abstract. It influenced daily life, with Mafalda expressing concern over Philip's SA uniform and party badges, symbols she associated with violence, while he saw them as tools for influence. The tension peaked in the late 1930s as Germany's annexation of Austria in 1938 and the outbreak of war in 1939 forced Mafalda to confront the human cost, confiding in her journal, later destroyed, but referenced in family letters, her fear that the regime's militarism would destroy Europe, a fear that contrasted with Philip's optimism about a quick victory. This moral and political divide, while not fracturing their love, evidenced by their continued correspondence during his frequent absences, added a layer of strain, with Mafalda's compassion clashing against Philippe's pragmatism, creating moments of quiet conflict that underscored the personal toll of ideological alignment in their marriage. While Philippe immersed himself in the political machinations of the Third Reich, attending Reichstag sessions, coordinating with Hermann Göring on provincial policies, and traveling for diplomatic missions, Mafalda focused on domestic stability, channeling her energies into creating a nurturing environment for their 4 children that served as a sanctuary from the external chaos. Her role as a mother became an act of quiet resistance, a deliberate counter to the regime's intrusion into family life through youth organizations like the Hitler Youth in Belia, which she viewed as indoctrination tools. Mafalda made a deliberate effort to shield her children from the gathering darkness, limiting their exposure to Nazi propaganda by carefully selecting their tutors, preferring non-party members with classical educations, and monitoring school curricula in Rome's private institutions to exclude fascist textbooks that glorified war and racism. She curated their reading materials to include classics like Goethe's Faust for moral complexity and Dante's Divine Comedy for ethical reflection, rather than regime-approved texts like Hitler's Mein Kampf or Alfredo Oriani's nationalist novels pushed in Italian schools. During family visits to Germany, often for holidays at castle estates, she emphasized cultural outings to museums like the Pergamon in Berlin, or concerts featuring Bach and Mozart at the Gewandhaus in Leipzig. Over the political rallies her husband was obligated to attend, such as the 1937 Nuremberg rally where he marched with SA units. This choice was intentional, as Mafalda believed exposure to art and music fostered independent thinking, countering the regime's emphasis on obedience and racial purity. As the war intensified after Italy's entry in June 1940, with Germany's invasions of the Low Countries and France leading to widespread devastation, Mafalda's protective instincts became even more critical, evolving into a full-time endeavor amid the direct threats to civilian life. Bombing raids on Rome by the RAF and USAAF began in earnest in 1943, with the July 19th attack on the San Lorenzo district killing over 3,000 and damaging historic sites, forcing the family to seek shelter in air raid basements multiple times weekly, where Mafalda calmed the children with stories and songs to mask the explosions. Severe rationing shortages, bread limited to 150 grams per day, meat scarce, and fuel for heating unavailable, compounded the dangers, with Mafalda queuing for hours at distribution centers or bartering family heirlooms for food, all while maintaining a routine of normalcy through home-cooked meals and bedtime rituals. She adapted by organizing homeschooling from 1941 onward, hiring private tutors fluent in multiple languages to avoid the increasingly fascist public schools under Mussolini's education minister Giuseppe Bottai, where curricula included mandatory lessons on racial hygiene and imperial history that Mafalda deemed poisonous. This home education focused on humanities and sciences, with Mafalda personally teaching music and literature, ensuring the children, Moritz, Heinrich, Otto, and Elizabeth, developed critical thinking skills free from propaganda. Her protective role extended to discreet relief work, where she collaborated with church networks like the Pontifical Commission for Assistance, distributing food parcels containing canned goods and blankets to bombed-out families in Rome's suburbs, often at personal risk as Allied spies infiltrated such groups. Through Caritas Italiana, she volunteered anonymously, visiting orphanages and hospitals to provide aid, drawing on her World War I nursing experience to tend to the wounded, all while shielding her children from these activities to prevent their association with potential anti-regime elements. Maintaining a facade of normalcy was paramount. Mafalda organized family picnics in the Villa Ada gardens during lulls in raids, read fairy tales by the Brothers Grimm to instill moral lessons, and celebrated birthdays with handmade gifts amid shortages, creating an illusion of security that buffered the psychological impact of war. Rooted in her deep moral opposition to the regime, her devotion as a mother became the last line of defense to protect her children from the influence of totalitarianism, where the moral divergence with Philipp, his acceptance of war as necessary for German revival versus her view of it as destructive folly, manifested in her determination to preserve her children's innocence, even as the family's position grew precarious with Italy's faltering alliance. The ideological chasm between them deepened as the war progressed, with Mafalda's Catholic-influenced morality clashing more starkly against Philip's political immersion. Her dislike for Nazism's brutality was not passive. She privately condemned the regime's anti-Semitism, influenced by papal encyclicals like Pius XI's 1937 Mit brennender Sorge, criticizing Nazi racial doctrines, which she discussed in coded letters to her sister Giovanna. This moral stance created tension during Philip's visits, where conversations about his art procurements, often involving works from Jewish collections, led to quiet arguments, with Mafalda questioning the ethics of such transactions as exploitation, while Philip defended them as cultural preservation. Politically, Mafalda's reservations about militarism were heightened by the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, which she saw as a needless crusade that would bring ruin, contrasting Philip's enthusiasm for the Eastern Front as a blow against communism. This divergence added emotional strain, with Mafalda's empathy for war victims expressed through her relief efforts, highlighting her husband's complicity in a system that perpetrated those sufferings. Yet her role as mother amplified this resistance. By shielding the children from propaganda, she actively subverted the regime's attempt to indoctrinate the next generation, a form of moral defiance that preserved family integrity amid political discord. As bombing raids escalated in 1943, Mafalda's maternal role became a frontline defense, organizing evacuation drills and stocking shelters with books and games to distract the children from fear, while her relief work extended protection beyond the family, aiding hundreds through church distributions. This period underscored the moral political veneer. Her actions embodied a Catholic ethic of care opposing Nazism's cruelty, while Philip's absence for regime duties left her to navigate the war's horrors alone, her devotion ensuring the children's survival in body and spirit against totalitarianism's encroachment. Prince Philip's fall from grace was as swift as his rise had been. From a trusted envoy of the Führer, he was now an enemy of the Reich, a Sonderhäftling, or special prisoner. He was stripped of his ranks and imprisoned in Flossenburg concentration camp, held in complete isolation. This is the central controversy of his life. Was he a true believer in Nazism, who was simply discarded when he was no longer useful? Or was he an opportunist who tragically misjudged the monster he was serving? After the war, Philip would claim that he had joined the party with noble intentions, hoping to use his influence to moderate the regime's excesses and guide it towards a more traditional monarchist system. He argued that he was naive, not malicious. Many historians, however, view this as a self-serving excuse. The evidence suggests Philippe was an early and genuine enthusiast of fascism, attracted by its anti-communist stance and its promise of national revival. He actively participated in the regime, using his connections to benefit both himself and the Nazi cause. He was not a victim in the same sense as the millions who were persecuted for their race, religion, or political beliefs. He was a collaborator who was ultimately betrayed by his fellow criminals. His experience in the camps, however, was undeniably real. Though he was a special prisoner and spared the daily horrors faced by ordinary inmates, his life was in constant peril. He was a valuable hostage, but he was also a man who knew too much. As the Allied armies closed in, the SS began liquidating high-profile prisoners to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Philipp was moved from Flossenburg to Dachau, always just one step ahead of a potential execution order. He survived through a combination of luck and the chaos of the Reich's final collapse. When he was finally liberated by American troops in May 1945, his ordeal was not over. He was no longer a prisoner of the Nazis, but he was now a prisoner of the Allies. After his liberation from the Nazis, Prince Philipp was held by the Allies and forced to confront his past. He was put on trial in a German denazification court. The proceedings painted a damning picture of his willing collaboration, his role as a Nazi governor, and his close personal ties to Hitler and Goering. He was initially classified as a major offender and sentenced to a heavy fine and the confiscation of a large part of his property. This verdict was later revised, and he was reclassified as a lesser offender and released in 1948. He returned to a world utterly changed. His country was in ruins and divided, but his most devastating loss was personal. It was only after his release that he learned the full, horrific details of his wife Mafalda's death in Buchenwald. He would have to live with the knowledge that his political choices had led directly to the brutal death of the woman he loved, a burden of guilt he would carry for the rest of his life. In the decades that followed, Prince Philip withdrew from public life. He dedicated himself to what he had always loved, art. He worked tirelessly to recover the family's extensive art collections, which had been looted and scattered during the war. He became the head of the House of Hesse and focused on preserving his family's cultural heritage. His historical significance is a powerful and uncomfortable one. His story represents the disastrous moral compromise made by a significant part of the European aristocracy in the face of fascism. He is a case study in how the allure of restored power and the fear of communism could lead men of culture and privilege to embrace a profoundly evil ideology. He embodies how fear of communism and hunger for restored rank led parts of Europe's nobility into catastrophe. He represents the catastrophic moral failure of a portion of the European aristocracy. His story is a stark cautionary tale of how the desire to reclaim a lost world can lead a man of culture and privilege to embrace a monstrous ideology. Instead of controlling the regime used him, and in the end, it destroyed the thing he held most dear, his own family. Philip's life is less about contradiction than about consequence. The bargains elites make can destroy what they most cherish. He made a deal with National Socialism, hoping to use its power for his own ends. Instead, that power consumed him and ultimately destroyed the person he loved most. He survived the war and lived for another 35 years, a long life spent in the shadows of his past. He succeeded in preserving his family's artistic treasures and passing on the headship of his house to his son, but he could never restore what was truly lost. His story is a powerful reminder that the choices we make, especially the moral compromises we accept in the pursuit of power or security, have consequences that can echo through generations. Prince Philip of Hesse sought to reclaim a throne, but in the end, he inherited only a legacy of tragedy and a lifetime of regret.